Get away from that pool right now, or I'm calling the police! Marcus Wellington froze, chlorine water still dripping from his body onto marble that cost more than most cars. 30 seconds ago, he'd been floating peacefully in his own infinity pool. Now, a security guard stood at his gate, radio in hand, treating him like a threat. "I live here," Marcus said quietly. "Sure you do." The guard's eyes swept him dismissively. "Pool maintenance isn't supposed to swim during work hours." Behind the fence, Mrs. Patterson aimed her iPhone like a weapon. "I've lived here 3 years and never seen him before." Marcus felt that familiar burn, the one that came when your existence became suspicious. Here in his own backyard, in swim shorts, in a neighborhood where he'd paid $2.4 million cash, he was being reduced to a criminal assumption. The guard stepped closer, hand on radio. "ID, now." What happens when success meets suspicion? This moment reveals how real-life stories become black stories, when touching stories about belonging turn into life stories about fighting for basic dignity in your own home. Marcus reached for his towel, every movement deliberate. The security guard's hand stayed near his radio, eyes tracking like Marcus might bolt. "License is inside," Marcus said calmly. "You stay put. Don't move." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried over the fence. "See? Real homeowners don't act this evasive." Marcus dried his shoulders, suppressing bitter irony. 20 minutes ago, he'd been doing laps, thinking about quarterly projections. Now he stood in his own backyard being treated like a criminal for swimming while black. The guard keyed his radio. "Unit 7 requesting backup. Possible trespassing at 847 Maple Ridge." "Copy. HOA president en route." Marcus's watch buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Board call moved to 3:45. Everything okay?" He glanced at the message. A mistake. "Put the device down," the guard snapped. "It's a watch." "I can see that. Keep your hands visible." The absurdity struck him. Here stood a man who'd built a technology company from nothing, who employed hundreds, whose AI software helped eliminate hiring bias at Fortune 500 companies. Yet he couldn't prove his right to exist in swim shorts on property he owned. A silver BMW pulled up. Sharon Morrison emerged in tennis whites, face tight with annoyance. Marcus remembered her from his welcome packet signing, the same woman now approaching him like a problem requiring management. "What's the situation?" Sharon asked the guard, not Marcus. "Individual claims residency, no immediate verification, multiple neighbor complaints." Sharon studied Marcus with the calculating gaze of someone used to categorizing people. "And you are?" "Marcus Wellington. I purchased this house February 2023, cash transaction. You were present for the paperwork." Her expression remained blank. Professional politeness masking complete non-recognition. "I process many transactions. Do you have documentation?" "Inside my house, which you're preventing me from accessing." "We have protocols for these situations," Sharon said, phone appearing in her hand. "Especially when individuals cannot provide immediate verification of their residential status." Individuals. Not residents, not homeowners. Individuals whose very presence required official validation. Marcus felt the familiar institutional weight pressing down. They weren't seeing an inconvenienced neighbor. They were seeing a black man whose belonging required proof, whose presence demanded explanation, whose existence in this space challenged their assumptions about who belonged in luxury. "Personal business during an investigation," the guard muttered as Marcus's phone buzzed again. The mathematics of bias played out in real time. Every text became suspicious activity. Every calm response became evasiveness. Every reasonable request became resistance to authority. Sharon stepped closer, voice taking on bureaucratic authority. "Sir, you'll need to accompany me while we verify your claims through proper channels." "Verify my claims to live in my own house?" "We have procedures for community safety." Community safety. The phrase that sanitized every intrusion, justified every assumption, legitimized every moment when someone's mere presence became a threat requiring management. A second security vehicle pulled up. 2 more guards emerged, their arrival transforming a simple, mistaken identity into something resembling an arrest. Marcus recognized the escalation pattern, how quickly situations spiraled when bias met bureaucracy. Mrs. Patterson had moved to her front yard now, phone held high, broadcasting live to whatever social media platform promised the most engagement. Her voice carried across the courtyard. "This is exactly why we pay HOA fees. Finally, someone's taking action." Taking action. Against a homeowner, in his own backyard. For the crime of swimming while black in a neighborhood where his mortgage payments helped fund the very security force now surrounding him. Marcus looked up at his home's security cameras, red lights blinking steadily. His own system documenting his humiliation. The same technology he helped develop to protect homeowners, now recording his dignity, being systematically dismantled by those claiming to protect his community. Sharon consulted her phone, scrolling through contacts. "I'm calling our property management company. They can verify current ownership records." "The deed is public record," Marcus said quietly. "We prefer official channels, more reliable than individual claims." Individual claims. His ownership of a $2.4 million property reduced to unverified assertions requiring third-party validation. Marcus checked his watch. 3:37 p.m. 8 minutes until his conference call. The same call where he'd discuss expanding Wellington Technology's bias detection software to residential communities. The exact technology that might have prevented this moment if these people had been interested in preventing rather than perpetuating their assumptions. The irony cut deeper than the humiliation. He was being profiled while developing tools to eliminate profiling, discriminated against while building systems to prevent discrimination. Marcus watched Sharon dial the property management company, her manicured fingers moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her calls answered immediately. The second security vehicle's arrival had drawn more neighbors from their homes, retirees in golf attire, stay-at-home mothers clutching coffee cups, teenagers with phones already recording. What started as a simple case of mistaken identity was becoming a neighborhood spectacle, complete with live social media coverage and growing crowd participation. "Yes, this is Sharon Morrison, HOA president for Maple Ridge Estates," she spoke into her phone with practiced authority. "We need immediate verification of ownership for 847 Maple Ridge Court. We have a situation here that requires official documentation." Marcus noticed how she avoided saying his name, reducing him to a situation that needed managing rather than a person who deserved basic respect. The linguistic choices weren't accidental. They were part of a systematic dehumanization that made what came next feel justified, even necessary. Mrs. Patterson had moved closer to the fence, her iPhone capturing every angle with the dedication of a documentary filmmaker. "Everyone needs to see this," she announced to her growing audience of 847 viewers and climbing. "This is what happens when communities stop being vigilant. Thank God we have proper security protocols." Her live stream comments were lighting up with responses. "Finally, someone taking action." And, "Where's the real homeowner?" The digital amplification was instantaneous. Ring doorbell footage already being shared in private Facebook groups, next-door notifications pinging across dozens of phones with warnings about suspicious activity on Maple Ridge Court. 3:19 p.m. The crowd swelled to 8 adults now, plus the teenagers recording from their bedroom windows. Mr. Chen from the corner house approached with his golden retriever, ostensibly walking his dog but clearly drawn by the commotion. "What's going on here?" he asked Sharon, not Marcus. "Security matter," Sharon replied curtly. "Nothing to worry about, just following proper procedures." Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street joined the gathering, her voice adding to the chorus. "I saw him earlier through my kitchen window. Didn't recognize him at all. Been here 5 years, know everyone on this block." The exclusion was complete. Marcus had become a third-person problem being discussed around him rather than a human being capable of speaking for himself. His phone buzzed with increasing urgency. Jessica's texts were becoming more frequent. "Sir, Johnson Industries executives asking for you. Forbes journalist confirmed for 5 p.m. Everything okay?" Each notification drew suspicious glares from the guards, who interpreted his professional obligations as suspicious behavior requiring additional scrutiny. "I'm getting tired of waiting," the original security guard announced, his patience clearly exhausted by what he perceived as unnecessary bureaucracy. "Sir, you need to come with us now while we sort this out at the security office." Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came when situations crossed from inconvenient to potentially dangerous. 3 armed guards, an agitated crowd, and a power structure that had already decided he didn't belong. The mathematics of escalation pointed toward outcomes he'd seen too many times on news reports. 3:21 p.m. A white van pulled up with Secure Communities, Inc. emblazoned on the side. 2 additional security personnel emerged, transforming the scene from neighborhood dispute to something resembling a coordinated law enforcement operation. The property manager, Linda Vasquez, climbed out of her Honda Civic looking harried and defensive. "What exactly is the emergency here?" she demanded, clipboard in hand. Sharon immediately cornered her. "This individual claims to own 847 Maple Ridge. We need immediate verification before this escalates further." The crowd's energy shifted palpably, sensing confrontation brewing. Mrs. Patterson adjusted her phone angle for better footage, her viewer count now approaching 1,200. "You're getting this, right?" she whispered to someone off camera. "This is exactly the kind of thing that needs to be documented." Comments flooded her stream. "Call the police already!" And "Why isn't he showing ID?" The teenagers in the windows leaned forward, their own phones capturing multiple angles of what they clearly expected to become a viral moment across TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat. Marcus realized he was standing at the center of a perfect storm. Institutional bias, amplified by social media, personal prejudice, legitimized by procedural authority, and individual assumptions validated by crowd participation. His own security cameras continued recording, red lights blinking steadily, documenting his humiliation in the same 4K resolution that was supposed to protect his privacy and safety. "Sir, last warning," the lead guard repeated, his voice carrying the edge of someone whose authority had been questioned too long. "Come with us peacefully, or we'll have to call for additional backup." Additional backup. As if 5 armed security personnel weren't sufficient to handle one man in swim shorts standing in his own driveway. The implicit threat hung in the air like humidity, comply or face escalation that nobody wanted, but everyone seemed willing to accept as necessary. 3:25 p.m. Linda Vasquez scrolled through her tablet, searching property records with the slow deliberation of someone who didn't want to make mistakes in front of an audience. "The system is running slowly today," she announced apologetically. "These verifications usually take a few minutes." A few minutes that felt like hours, while Marcus stood surrounded by people questioning his fundamental right to exist in the space he'd legally purchased, rightfully owned, and personally inhabited for over a year. Marcus looked around the circle of faces, searching for one person who might question what was happening, who might ask whether this response was proportionate to the alleged crime of existing while black in a luxury neighborhood. He found none. Instead, he saw the careful neutrality of people who'd already chosen sides, who'd decided that their comfort mattered more than his dignity, that their assumptions deserved more credibility than his truth. Sharon ended her call with visible frustration. "Property management main office is closed until tomorrow. We'll have to verify through other channels." She looked at Marcus with the expression of someone whose day had been unnecessarily complicated by his presence. "This could all be resolved very quickly if you'd simply cooperate with our security procedures." Cooperate. The word that transformed compliance into voluntary participation, that made his submission seem like a choice rather than coercion. 3:31 p.m. In the distance, the unmistakable sound of a police siren grew louder. Someone had escalated beyond HOA protocols. Marcus felt his world narrowing to this moment, standing in his own driveway, surrounded by neighbors who'd never bothered to learn his name, facing the arrival of law enforcement because his presence in his own home had been deemed sufficiently threatening to warrant official intervention. His conference call was now impossible, his schedule completely derailed, his professional reputation potentially damaged by his absence from commitments that mattered to the future of his company. The police cruiser's arrival marked the moment everything changed, though not in the way anyone expected. Officer Martinez stepped out with the measured calm of someone who'd responded to countless neighborhood disputes, his eyes scanning the crowd, the security personnel, and Marcus standing at the center. What he saw was a black man in swim shorts, surrounded by 5 security guards and agitated neighbors, a scene that, in his 15 years of police work, usually ended predictably. "What's the situation here?" Officer Martinez asked Sharon, his voice professionally neutral. Marcus watched the officer's eyes take in the expensive cars, manicured lawns, obvious wealth, then returned to him standing beside an infinity pool that cost more than most houses. The cognitive dissonance was visible. This didn't fit standard trespassing call profiles. Marcus could see Martinez's training kicking in, the systematic assessment that good cops learn to make when situations didn't match expectations. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," Sharon began, relief flooding her voice like someone who'd been waiting for rescue. "This individual claims to live here but cannot provide verification. Multiple residents confirm they've never seen him before. We're following proper protocols, but he's being uncooperative with our security procedures." The reframing stung deeply. Marcus had been nothing but patient throughout his systematic humiliation, yet somehow his calm responses had been transformed into resistance to authority. The linguistic gymnastics were impressive in their audacity. Mrs. Patterson, still live streaming to her growing audience of 1,847 viewers, added her commentary. "Officer, we called because this whole situation felt wrong. Real homeowners don't act this suspicious when asked simple questions." Her phone captured every angle, broadcasting Marcus's humiliation to an audience hungry for drama they could consume from the safety of their own screens. The comments were flying. "Finally some action," and "Where's the real owner?" The digital mob was forming in real time. Marcus felt the familiar weight of institutional momentum. A black man surrounded by white authority figures, his word against their assumptions, his truth competing with their predetermined narrative. The mathematics of American justice playing out on his own driveway, where his $2.4 million investment couldn't purchase basic dignity or presumption of innocence. His phone buzzed again with increasing urgency. This time he made a calculated decision that would change everything. Instead of ignoring the call as he'd been doing, he looked directly at Officer Martinez with the steady gaze of someone who'd spent years commanding boardrooms full of skeptical executives. "Officer, I appreciate you responding to this situation. May I answer this call? It's my assistant with information that could resolve this immediately." The request was delivered with quiet confidence, the tone of someone making a reasonable request rather than begging for permission. The request hung in air like a challenge. Martinez studied Marcus's demeanor, the calm voice despite obvious stress, the respectful tone despite clear provocation, the expensive watch that suggested resources beyond typical trespassing suspects, the Tesla with personalized plates reading "Innovate." Something fundamental wasn't adding up to the standard scenario he'd been called to handle. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts when details didn't align with expectations. "Go ahead," Martinez said carefully, his cop instincts overriding the crowd's expectations. "Keep it brief and on speaker so everyone can hear." The decision was tactical. If this man was lying, the call would expose him. If he was telling the truth, it would resolve the situation quickly. Either way, transparency would serve justice better than assumptions. Marcus touched his screen, feeling a familiar surge of quiet power, the same feeling he got before closing major deals or walking into hostile negotiations. This wasn't his first time facing a room full of skeptics who'd already decided he didn't belong. "Jessica, I'm here with law enforcement and HOA representatives. Could you explain why I might be unreachable for our 3:45 conference call?" The question was deliberately phrased, a gentle hook designed to reel in far more information than anyone expected. Jessica's voice came through with the professional confidence of someone accustomed to managing complex executive schedules. "Of course, Mr. Wellington. Should I reschedule the Johnson Industries merger discussion? The board members were asking about timing, and the executives were specifically asking about the Forbes interview at 5. Should I push that back as well?" Her tone carried the casual efficiency of discussing routine billion-dollar business, completely oblivious to the surreal context of the call. The freeze was immediate and complete. Mrs. Patterson's live stream continued broadcasting, but her running commentary stopped mid-sentence as her brain processed what she'd just heard. The security guards exchanged glances that spoke volumes about cracking assumptions and potential career implications. Sharon's face cycled through confusion, dawning recognition, and something approaching panic as the full scope of her mistake began settling in. Officer Martinez's eyebrows rose incrementally. Merger discussions and Forbes interviews weren't typical elements in trespassing suspects' afternoon schedules. Marcus allowed himself a moment of internal reflection, standing in the eye of this storm he hadn't created but was now positioned to resolve. 18 months ago, when he'd first walked through this house with his realtor, he'd imagined peaceful evenings by this very pool, not standing here defending his humanity to people who'd chosen assumption over inquiry. He thought about his childhood in Detroit, his mother's careful warnings about existing while black and white spaces that claimed to welcome everyone. She'd prepared him for moments like this with lessons about maintaining dignity no matter how others chose to see him, though she'd probably never imagined he'd face such challenges as a millionaire CEO in his own backyard. The irony cut deep. He'd spent his career developing AI software to eliminate bias in corporate hiring, helping Fortune 500 companies recognize and interrupt their unconscious prejudices. Yet here he stood, experiencing those same biases in their rawest form, watching algorithms of human assumption process his appearance and conclude threat rather than resident. His life's work was dedicated to preventing exactly this kind of systematic discrimination. "Jessica," Marcus continued, his voice maintaining perfect calm despite the emotional undertow, "could you also patch in our legal team? I think we might need some clarification about property rights and discrimination protocols in residential communities." The word discrimination landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the assembled crowd. Several neighbors suddenly found their phones far less interesting than they'd been moments before. 2 security guards took instinctive steps backward, their body language shifting from confrontational to defensive. "Certainly, sir. Should I also inform the Wellington Technologies Board that you'll be delayed due to what appears to be a community relations matter? They're expecting your input on the bias detection software expansion into residential security systems." The corporate terminology was doing its devastating work, each professional phrase dismantling assumptions and rebuilding the power structure in real time. Wellington Technologies, a name that meant nothing to most of the crowd but was clearly causing Sharon to search frantically on her phone for information she should have possessed 18 months ago. Officer Martinez was connecting dots with the trained efficiency of someone who'd learned to read situations that defied initial appearances. The expensive property, the Tesla with corporate vanity plates, the casual discussion of merger talks and Forbes interviews, the unflappable composure under pressure. None of this was matching any trespassing profile in his extensive experience. His instincts, honed by 15 years of separating truth from fiction, were screaming that he'd walked into something far more complex than a simple property dispute. "Sir," Martinez said to Marcus, his tone subtly shifting from interrogating a suspect to gathering information from a potential victim, "help me understand exactly what's happened here today. Take your time and walk me through everything from the beginning." The change in his approach was noticed by everyone present. The way he turned his body toward Marcus, the respectful address, the invitation to provide a complete narrative rather than defensive responses to accusations. Marcus nodded slowly, feeling the power dynamics shifting beneath his feet like tectonic plates finding new equilibrium after years of pressure. Officer Martinez, my name is Marcus Wellington. I am the founder and CEO of Wellington Technologies. I purchased this house in February 2023 for $2.4 million in a cash transaction. This afternoon, I was swimming laps in my own pool when security personnel arrived and demanded that I prove my right to be on my own property. When I offered to retrieve my identification from inside my house, I was ordered not to move. When I attempted to explain that I live here, I was accused of trespassing. When I tried to handle routine business calls, I was characterized as exhibiting suspicious behavior. The recitation was methodical, factual, and devastating in its simplicity. Each point built systematically on the last, creating a narrative that was impossible to dismiss, reframe, or rationalize away. Marcus continued with the same measured tone. Mrs. Morrison here personally signed my welcome packet when I moved in. She was present during the closing process, witnessed the transaction, and shook my hand when I received the keys. Yet somehow today, she claims not to remember me and insists on verifying my ownership through third-party sources rather than accepting my word or examining the readily available public records. Sharon's frantic phone searching had clearly yielded results she desperately didn't want to confront. Her voice emerged smaller and more tentative than it had been all afternoon. Mr. Wellington, there's obviously been some kind of misunderstanding here. If you're indeed the homeowner... But Marcus held up a gentle hand, stopping her mid-sentence with a gesture that was quiet but unmistakably authoritative. The practiced movement of someone accustomed to controlling rooms full of executives, not someone who needed to prove his fundamental right to exist in his own space. Jessica, Marcus said into his phone, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who just remembered exactly who he was and what he was capable of. Could you please conference in David Chen from our legal department? I believe Officer Martinez and the HOA representatives might benefit from understanding the potential legal implications of what's transpired here today. The phrase that transformed neighborhood disputes into potential federal lawsuits, casual assumptions into expensive liability, and everyday discrimination into the kind of problems that destroyed careers and bankrupted organizations. Jessica's voice returned with practiced efficiency. Of course, sir. David is available now. Should I also have him pull the files on our recent consulting work with residential security companies? Given that this involves Secure Communities, Inc., there might be some relevant conflict of interest considerations. The corporate machinery was beginning to turn, and everyone present could sense the grinding of gears that moved far more weight than anyone had anticipated. The security guards, who'd been so confident and confrontational minutes earlier, now looked like men seriously contemplating career changes and unemployment lines. Their radios crackled with dispatch traffic, but none of them seemed particularly eager to respond. Mrs. Patterson had stopped recording entirely, probably calculating whether her enthusiastic live stream constituted admissible evidence in a discrimination lawsuit. The viewer count on her abandoned broadcast had reached 2,341 people, all of whom had witnessed her gleeful participation in what was rapidly becoming a textbook case of racial profiling. Sharon was scrolling through what Marcus assumed were search results showing Wellington Technologies' $847 million annual revenue, his recognition as one of Forbes' quiet revolutionaries of corporate ethics, and probably several recent articles about his company's groundbreaking work in bias detection and elimination. Her face had progressed from confusion to recognition to something approaching existential dread as she realized the full scope of what she'd initiated. A new voice joined the call. David Chen, Wellington Technologies' chief legal counsel, speaking with the crisp authority of someone who'd spent years turning corporate discrimination into expensive lessons for organizations that thought they were too big or too careful to face consequences. Mr. Wellington, Jessica briefed me on the situation. Are you currently being detained or prevented from accessing your own property by private security personnel and HOA representatives? That's correct, David, Marcus replied, his voice maintaining the same measured tone he'd used throughout the entire ordeal. I've been surrounded by armed security guards, questioned about my right to exist on property I own, recorded without consent by neighbors, and subjected to demands for documentation to prove my residency in my own home. All of this while standing in my backyard in swim attire after taking an afternoon swim in my own pool. David's voice carried the satisfaction of an attorney who specialized in exactly these kinds of cases. I see. And this occurred in Arizona, which has particularly strong statutes regarding discrimination in housing and property access. Officer, are you there? Could you confirm that Mr. Wellington has been cooperating fully and hasn't been accused of any actual criminal activity? Officer Martinez, who was rapidly realizing he'd walked into a legal minefield that could define his remaining career, cleared his throat carefully. That's correct, Counselor. Mr. Wellington has been completely cooperative. No criminal activity has been alleged or observed. This appears to have been initiated as a property verification matter by private security and HOA personnel. Excellent, David continued with the methodical precision of someone building a federal case in real time. Then we're looking at potential violations of the Fair Housing Act, Section 1982 Civil Rights Statutes, and Arizona's Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act. Mr. Wellington, have any of these individuals or organizations received federal funding or operated under federal contracts that would bring them under additional civil rights jurisdictions? Marcus allowed himself a small smile, the first genuine expression of satisfaction he'd felt all afternoon. Actually, David, that's an interesting question. Secure Communities, Inc. provides services under several federal contracts, and if I recall correctly, Maple Ridge Estates received federal tax incentives as part of the Opportunity Zone Development Program. Jessica, could you pull those files? The legal net was tightening with mechanical precision, each revelation adding another layer of federal jurisdiction and potential liability. Sharon Morrison looked like someone who'd accidentally triggered an avalanche while trying to move a small rock. The security guards were having whispered conversations that probably involved phrases like resume update and wrongful termination lawsuit. Officer Martinez, demonstrating the survival instincts that had kept him employed for 15 years, began taking careful notes. Mr. Wellington, would you like to file a formal complaint about what happened here today? It sounds like there may have been some procedural irregularities that warrant official documentation. Marcus looked around the circle of faces, at Mrs. Patterson clutching her silent phone, at the security guards studying their shoes with sudden intensity, at Sharon Morrison, whose afternoon had transformed from routine HOA enforcement into potential career suicide. The moment belonged to him now, not through volume or threats or dramatic gestures, but because truth had finally been given room to breathe and grow and reshape the reality around it. Officer Martinez, Marcus said quietly, I think that would be appropriate. But first, I believe we need to have a more comprehensive discussion about how situations like this can be prevented in the future. David, could you conference in our community relations specialist? I think we're going to need some systematic reforms. The systematic dismantling of careers began within hours, though Marcus would later reflect that it felt more like watching dominoes fall than delivering justice. By 6:30 p.m. that evening, the lead security guard who'd initially confronted him received a call from Secure Communities Inc.'s regional manager. The conversation lasted exactly 97 seconds and ended with immediate termination, effective immediately, with the incident noted permanently in his employment file as discriminatory conduct resulting in significant corporate liability exposure. Sharon Morrison's downfall took slightly longer, but was infinitely more public. By Thursday morning, an emergency HOA board meeting had been called by residents who'd watched Mrs. Patterson's viral live stream, now approaching 50,000 views across multiple platforms, and read the resulting local news coverage. The headline in the Arizona Republic read, "Tech CEO harassed by HOA in own backyard," accompanied by a photo of Marcus standing calmly beside his pool while surrounded by security personnel. The optics were devastating and undeniable. The emergency vote was unanimous. Sharon was removed from her position as HOA president, required to issue a public written apology to be posted on the community website and mailed to every household, and mandated to complete 40 hours of sensitivity training at her own expense. Her real estate license, which depended on maintaining community standing and avoiding discrimination complaints, came under review by the Arizona Department of Real Estate within the week. Mrs. Patterson faced consequences that extended far beyond her deleted social media accounts. Her enthusiastic live stream, preserved forever in digital amber, had captured her gleeful participation in what employment lawyers were already calling a textbook case of residential racial profiling. The video became required viewing in 3 university courses on modern discrimination and was cited in 2 pending federal civil rights cases. Her attempts to scrub the content from the internet only amplified its spread, turning her into an unwitting poster child for how quickly bias could destroy reputations in the social media age. The property manager, Linda Vasquez, managed to keep her job, but found herself reassigned to commercial properties after completing mandatory bias training and agreeing to implement new verification protocols that prioritized dignity over suspicion. Her company, recognizing the liability exposure from the incident, quietly settled with Marcus for an undisclosed amount that funded the next phase of systemic reform. But individual consequences were only the beginning. Marcus had built his career on understanding that lasting change required structural transformation, not just personal accountability. Within 30 days of the incident, Wellington Technologies announced Project Dignity, a comprehensive bias elimination program that would be piloted in residential communities across Arizona before expanding nationally. The program's centerpiece was a revolutionary bias detection app that integrated with existing security systems to flag potentially discriminatory responses before they escalated. When security personnel reported suspicious activity, the system prompted a series of bias interruption questions. What specific behavior raises concern? Have you observed this same behavior from residents of different demographics? What evidence supports your assessment beyond appearance? The technology Marcus had developed for corporate hiring was being adapted to protect people in their own neighborhoods. Secure Communities, Inc., facing the potential loss of $12 billion in annual contracts managed by Wellington Technologies' corporate clients, became the program's most enthusiastic early adopter. Within 60 days, every security officer in their employ was required to wear body cameras that remained active during all resident interactions, with footage automatically flagged by AI systems when conversations contained discriminatory language or showed disparate treatment patterns. The HOA transformation was equally comprehensive. Maple Ridge Estates became the testing ground for new community governance standards that Marcus personally helped design. The Inclusive Living Charter required all board members to complete quarterly bias training, established clear protocols for resident verification that prioritized respect over suspicion, and created an anonymous reporting system for discrimination complaints. Marcus accepted appointment to the community's newly created Diversity Oversight Committee, a position that gave him direct input into policies affecting his neighbors. Monthly community dialogue sessions became mandatory for board members, creating space for residents to address concerns before they escalated into confrontations. The same pool deck where he'd been questioned now hosted these sessions, the irony lost on no one. The digital footprint of discrimination proved harder to erase than its perpetrators had hoped. Nextdoor permanently banned posts containing discriminatory language about residents, implementing AI moderation systems developed by Wellington Technologies. Ring doorbell footage sharing came under new community guidelines that prohibited posting videos intended to shame or profile neighbors based on appearance, rather than behavior. Local news coverage of the reforms attracted national attention. Business schools began using the case as a study in how individual courage could catalyze institutional change. Marcus found himself speaking at conferences about bias in community governance, sharing stages with civil rights lawyers and urban planning experts who saw his experience as a blueprint for systematic reform. The ripple effects extended far beyond Maple Ridge Estates. 17 other luxury developments in Arizona requested Wellington Technologies' bias detection software after reading about the incident. Real estate industry publications featured Marcus's story as a cautionary tale about the financial risks of discrimination, with property values and insurance rates increasingly tied to documented bias prevention measures. Corporate clients increased their bias training budget requests by 340% within 6 months, recognizing that discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, but economically catastrophic in an era of viral videos and federal lawsuits. Wellington Technologies' Community Equity Consulting Division grew from a single pilot program to a $50 million business unit serving residential developments across 12 states. The most satisfying transformation was personal. Marcus's home security system, which had documented his humiliation in excruciating detail, now served a different purpose. The same cameras that captured his dignity being stripped away were repurposed to monitor compliance with new bias prevention protocols, ensuring that future residents would never face the assumptions that had turned his peaceful afternoon into a federal case study. 6 months after the incident, Marcus stood beside the same infinity pool where everything had started, but the setting had transformed completely. Instead of facing interrogation, he was hosting the quarterly Maple Ridge Community Relations meeting, where neighbors who'd once questioned his right to exist now sought his input on inclusive policies and bias prevention strategies. The water still reflected the Arizona sky, but the community around it had been fundamentally altered. Security personnel now approached situations with respect rather than suspicion. HOA policies prioritized dignity over demographics. Neighbors had learned the difference between vigilance and bias, between safety and systematic exclusion. Marcus had discovered that real change happened not through individual revenge, but through institutional transformation, not through winning arguments, but through rewriting the rules that created those arguments in the first place. His humiliation had become a catalyst for community-wide reform that would protect countless future residents from facing the same assumptions that had reduced him to a threat requiring official intervention. Marcus stood beside his infinity pool exactly 1 year later, but this time the water reflected more than Arizona sky. It mirrored a fundamentally transformed community and a legacy that stretched far beyond the boundaries of Maple Ridge Estates. The same deck where he'd been interrogated for existing while black now served as the headquarters for the Wellington Community Equity Initiative, a $5 million foundation dedicated to eliminating bias in residential communities across America. The transformation had exceeded even his most optimistic projections. What began as a humiliating afternoon had evolved into a movement that was reshaping how Americans thought about belonging, assumptions, and the subtle mathematics of discrimination that operated in supposedly progressive spaces. The incident that could have destroyed his faith in justice had instead become proof that individual courage, when combined with systematic thinking and patient persistence, could create changes that outlasted any single confrontation. Wellington Technologies' Project Dignity had expanded beyond his wildest expectations. The bias detection software originally designed for corporate hiring was now protecting residents in 847 residential developments across North America. The technology that identified discriminatory language and flagged disparate treatment patterns had prevented countless incidents like his own, interrupting bias before it escalated into humiliation, before assumptions became accusations, before suspicion became systematic exclusion. The data told a story that vindicated every difficult moment of that afternoon confrontation. 6 months after implementation, discrimination incidents in partner communities had decreased by 78%. Security training programs emphasizing dignity over suspicion had become standard industry practice in residential developments from Phoenix to Portland. Bias interruption had evolved from an experimental concept into a fundamental requirement for community safety certification. Marcus reflected on the broader implications as he watched his neighbors, people who'd once questioned his right to exist in this space, now seeking his guidance on inclusive policies and bias prevention strategies. The same HOA that had demanded verification of his ownership now consulted him on every major community decision. Mrs. Patterson, whose viral live stream had documented her own discrimination, now served as a cautionary example in bias training programs nationwide, her moment of cruelty transformed into education that protected others. The personal growth had been equally profound. Marcus had learned that silent power was indeed temporary power, that real change required using both voice and influence in concert, rather than relying on wealth alone to shield him from discrimination. The afternoon when he'd been reduced to proving his humanity had taught him that success without systematic advocacy was merely individual privilege, not community progress. His speaking engagements at universities and conferences had become opportunities to share a deeper truth. That discrimination persisted not because people were inherently evil, but because systems were inherently flawed. The same neighbors who'd questioned his belonging weren't necessarily racist individuals. They were people operating within biased frameworks that made their assumptions feel rational, their suspicions seem justified, their exclusion appear necessary for community safety. The economic impact had been staggering and undeniable. Property values in communities that implemented Wellington's bias prevention protocols increased by an average of 12% within 18 months, as buyers specifically sought neighborhoods with documented inclusive practices. Insurance companies began offering reduced premiums to developments that could demonstrate systematic bias elimination, recognizing that discrimination was expensive in legal settlements, reputation damage, and resident turnover. Marcus's story had become required reading in business schools, studying the intersection of social justice and corporate responsibility. His experience proved that addressing bias wasn't just morally imperative, but financially advantageous, that inclusive communities were more stable, more valuable, and more sustainable than those that operated on exclusion and assumption. The ripple effects continued expanding in ways he'd never anticipated. Federal housing authorities had begun requiring bias prevention training for any development receiving government funding. Real estate licensing boards were incorporating discrimination awareness into continuing education requirements. Community associations nationwide were adopting policies modeled on the reforms that emerged from his humiliation beside this very pool. But perhaps the most meaningful change was generational. Children in the neighborhood who'd watched the incident unfold from their bedroom windows had learned powerful lessons about standing up to injustice, about questioning assumptions, about recognizing that someone's appearance didn't determine their belonging. Teachers were using age-appropriate versions of his story to help students understand bias, privilege, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of demographic differences. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened the Community Equity app that now served as a model for residential developments nationwide. The dashboard showed real-time data from partner communities, bias incidents prevented, discrimination complaints resolved, inclusive policies implemented, numbers that represented real people protected from the kind of humiliation he'd experienced, families who could exist in their own neighborhoods without proving their right to belong. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Marcus felt the satisfaction that came from transforming personal pain into systemic progress. The pool where he'd been questioned for swimming, while Black now hosted community meetings where neighbors collaborated on inclusive policies. The driveway where he'd been surrounded by suspicious security guards now welcomed visitors to bias prevention workshops that were changing hearts and minds across the Southwest. The incident that could have become just another story of discrimination overcome had instead become a blueprint for community transformation. His humiliation had been converted into systematic reform that would protect countless others from facing similar assumptions. The afternoon when his dignity was stripped away had become the foundation for rebuilding how American communities understood belonging, bias, and the basic humanity of all residents regardless of race, class, or appearance. Marcus looked up at his home's security cameras, their red lights still blinking steadily. The same technology that had documented his degradation now monitored compliance with bias prevention protocols, ensuring that future residents would never face the systematic assumptions that had turned his peaceful swim into a federal case study. The cameras that captured his humiliation had become guardians of dignity for everyone who came after. This experience taught me that real change happens when individual courage meets institutional pressure, Marcus reflected, his voice carrying across the water. When someone has the audacity to transform their worst moment into society's teachable moment. The community around him had learned that inclusion wasn't just about being nice. It was about being smart, being sustainable, being the kind of place where everyone's humanity was recognized from the first moment they appeared. Have you witnessed injustice in your community? These real-life stories become the touching stories that reshape entire neighborhoods, the black stories that prove ordinary moments can become extraordinary movements, the life stories that demonstrate how personal experiences can become catalysts for systematic change. Comment below with your story. Transformation starts with speaking up. Share if you've ever been underestimated. Follow for more real-life stories that prove individual courage creates lasting change when combined with systematic thinking and persistent advocacy.